Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Berlin and the Fraunhofer Forum here in the center of Berlin. I guess most of you have been here already last year, so then you might have seen my talk on the last year's event. I'll try to give you some updates since then, so to say, what we are doing at Fraunhofer Focus in my department. So just in brief, there are two legs I'm standing on. On the one hand, I'm professor at the Technical University of Berlin, so I'm tutoring PhD students and master students in this field of converging networks and control platforms. And on the other hand, my other leg is to lead a quite good team at Fraunhofer Focus, the next generation network infrastructures team, where we are building toolkits for operators and vendors to play with the newest technologies. And so we have invited you yesterday already to show you our newest baby, which is the 5G playground. And there's an ecosystem around this, which I want to introduce to you a little bit, but also trying to motivate a little bit what is this 5G and what are the contributing technologies which makes it complicated. And you have to be an engineer to understand the full story. So in this regard, most of you know we played around with SIP long ago when Jiri and Dorkham were still with us. And basically this whole thinking was also a nice model for what we are doing still until today. So we are enabling, let's say, new emerging networking technologies in the mobile space, although we always kept an eye on the fixed network, and so fixed mobile convergence is the prime target of what we are trying to take into account. And in fact, you see these generations which more or less have inspired our research in the past, where we built toolkits. Basically, we try to focus on the, let's call it, key enabling technologies in these environments in order, as a research institute, to have as much as possible or many as possible partners and customers to do the research. And we instantiated these toolkits in our own premises in what we called playgrounds for engineers. So it was first the OpenIMS playground with our OpenIMS core toolkit. The Fuseco playground, a more artificial name, was for the open EPC infrastructure, but also taking into account that there's still IMS, but an emerging machine-type communications world coming up. And now we are in 5G, and you see that the number of toolkits is also getting a little bit higher because the environment is much more complex. So the 5G playground is what we are these days operating, and it is part of a bigger initiative, and you will probably hear soon more official announcements. We are currently in the final discussions with the Senate of Berlin to make Berlin a 5G capital for, let's say, not only Germany, but for Europe and in the world. So we do this together with our colleagues from Heinrich Hertz Institute, which is a remarkable, outstanding research organization for the wireless and optical networking infrastructure. And combining these competencies with our competencies in the control plane, in the IT domain, I think gives a quite good, let's say, pool of know-how and infrastructure for doing research. So 5G is these days all around us. And what is it? Is it just an extension of 4G and LTE? And many people these days talk about a new wireless technology, a new radio interface, which has much better capabilities and attributes than the past wireless access network technologies. This is to some extent true, but 5G is much, much more. And it is really about a complete rethink of the telecoms environment, of course driven from the mobile domain, but particularly also taking into account the fixed network infrastructure. And when you take a look on the main driver for the requirements of emerging mobile communication systems, we have to look at the NGMN, the Next Generation Mobile Networking Alliance. And they have created an interesting white paper. So the major operators of the globe are part of this mafia, I would call it. And on the other hand, we see white papers coming up from 5G PPP, which is the European Private-Public Partnership project, trying to save Europe in this domain, because Asia and the US are also moving fast ahead into this context. But what it is basically stating, this white paper, and I could really recommend, take a look at this. You will be astonished. It's much more about business models and IT. It's about software-defined networking technology. It's about network function virtualization. And it's just a little bit on wireless access networking technologies and a new radio interface. And interesting in this context is, and basically I tried to do my own drawing to illustrate the impacting disciplines in this environment. And this is particularly a classical evolution of the mobile network environment. So this means we have to take into account existing radio access network technologies, particularly those which are IP-based, so 3G, and particularly LTE and LTE Advanced. But there will also be a new wireless interface coming up, which particularly is implemented based on massive MIMO infrastructure. So we have lots of more antenna systems which have to cooperate in order to provide the bandwidth which is foreseen in this environment, which is far beyond the LTE speed and bandwidth. But on the other hand, it is clear that we also go into an architecture which has to take into account the fixed network infrastructure as well. And last but not least, satellites are coming back. So this whole environment has understood that also SDN and virtual network technologies can enable this quite classic isolated environment. So the satellite is part of this. So this means we really have a complete convergence of access networks in this software-driven environment. And I think this is the most important statement, software-driven. So particularly the advances in SDN will play a major role in this context, as well as new, let's call it, technology views on how to realize telecommunication infrastructures, namely by virtualized control planes and virtualized access network technologies and virtualized devices. So the virtualized set-top box is one example in this environment as well. So network function virtualization in combination with software-defined networking. And the new animal in this context is called mobile edge computing. So this is something which describes more or less distributed data center architectures and the capability to move content and control to the edge of the network, close to the customer, close to the place where a specific service is needed. And one of those applications which very often is mentioned is autonomous driving. So this means there's a massive amount of data which has to be provided to the cars, and this has to be provided with low latency, and in order to cope with this you need locality. And so this means we talk about a very agile, dynamic, distributed system which takes into account network function virtualization because these control components are virtualized. So this means these are IT control architecture paradigms which really go into this environment. Plus, now we have to think about the applications. And multimedia is not dead. We talk here about real-time communications in this conference. But to be honest, let's say we have understood from the classical telecommunications world that thanks to WhatsApp and Skype and all these other guys, it is very difficult to make money in this domain and or to realize the money flow which we have seen in the past. So of course we talk about multimedia, which typically is video and content dominated in this context. We talk about secure, special communication networks. Let's talk about security and military environments in this context. But most particularly, most of the use cases which are discussed in 5G are related to machine-to-machine communications. So this means programming the manufacturing devices in factories, talking about, and I think there should be a slide describing this, so these are use cases which have been described in this NGMN white paper. You see, as I mentioned before, multimedia is not dead. So we have here this kind of pervasive video and broadcast services which fall into this domain. But those who have this yellow arrow are much more related to the machine-to-machine communications. And this means we have sensor networks which aggregate a lot of data, which has to be processed in order to provide or enable, for instance, smart cities. And those applications, we have security communications, which probably also take into account some of these sensor infrastructures. E-health is one of those quite interesting applications, and remote surgery is one of those application use cases considered, so that a doctor can sit somewhere else and remotely operates on a patient. And you need for this something which is called low latency. And the ultimate term for low latency is these days called the tactile internet. And this tactile internet is really to go into this ideally 1 or far below 10 milliseconds of delay in order to have a real feedback and the tactile style of control. Yeah, so what you should keep in mind or take home is we talk about applications which are far beyond what we have done in the past. Yeah? So controlling and getting much deeper into many industrial domains. And on the other hand, when you look at these use cases, you can see quite different capabilities. So this slide just, and I have to skip through many of those slides due to the time, otherwise I'm talking too long about the whole thing. But the principle is that we have here different markets which should be addressed by this technology. And this relates to this classical subscriber communications market, but we have a very complex, and it is very difficult to describe this, isolate the capabilities. The Internet of Things is something which is these days mushrooming, and that there are different, let's call it subdomains. I would call it subdomains because, for instance, smart grid, e-health, or the autonomous car or the automotive industry, whenever there's a machine, it is a thing. And of course, connecting this means the Internet of Things. So probably we have to be a little bit more careful in using this term. But nevertheless, a very specific one is called the industrial Internet. And this is where we believe there's a lot of money in, because it's Industry 4.0, which these days is also a new buzzword for the connected factory, for the in real-time reprogramming of machines in order to produce goods, and think about just the 3D printers which will change our life in the future, where we on a specific place can produce things which are needed on this place, whatever this means. Okay. So different domains with completely different stakeholders, and this is something we have to understand. It's not anymore the classic network operator which can address the users in this context. Okay, the network operators around the globe try to support this and to provide not only the bit pipe, but also there are lots of projects to explore these different application domains and try to create and understand the future value chain. 5G should enable all this, and this is just to understand the different capabilities which a 5G system should support. And this is something I have taken from a 3GPP document. It should show that we have application domains where the critical communication, so high reliability, is key. We have other applications where particularly we have to cope with high speed. We have applications where really lots of systems should communicate with real-time capabilities, because when cars are very close and have to avoid getting in touch with each other, here you need really a very fast and reliable communication. On the other hand, we have massive communication in the sense that, for instance, support of services in stadiums, but as well in agriculture, where you have massive sensors, should be controlled. So long story short, so a 5G environment has to be highly flexible, supporting massive, big transport of data, big video downloads, up to small pieces of data which have to be exchanged to control something. So all an infrastructure which really should be very, very flexible. I don't go into the detail, but this is what typically is called the industrial internet, and we see again in this buzzword automotive, healthcare, agriculture, energy, and so on. So I skipped this slide as well. So just to get back what 5G should be, and here's another logo. It's the 5G Private-Public Partnership Project, which is undertaken by the European Commission. So the whole European industry, as well as some Asian subsidiaries, are taking part in this research, and they have basically described a few capabilities of this system. So it means a massive number of end systems, a guaranteed minimum data rate, human-oriented terminals, which somehow you see is just a subset of what we talk about, the IoT devices, high reliability, better locality or location capabilities, and up to 500 kilometers per hour speed support for high-speed trains and so on should be supported. So this is what the technology should be able to support. So in this context, and so you have seen, it is, unfortunately there's one which shows a little bit more the IT domain. In order to support these different application domains, which I mentioned here, the idea is that this 5G infrastructure is a programmable IT system which supports something which is called network slicing. And network slicing means that for the different application domains you create dynamically an overlay network architecture which provides the corresponding control platform plus user plane for a specific application domain. So that in the end we have a system which runs several virtual networks on top of a common infrastructure. And this means we can have an IoT slice for smart grid applications, and next to it in parallel we have a slice which is operated by another virtual network operator for the distribution of videos, for instance. So this means the enabling of virtual network operators who have a closer link to the customer is something which is quite key in this network infrastructure. And you can see this when this is the industrial internet. You can assume that there's another mafia active in the healthcare than in the automotive domain. And as we are talking to hospitals or insurance companies, or we talk to automotive companies, all of them are starting to think about, okay, let's become an own virtual network operator in order to have our most efficient supporting infrastructure. So what we are doing is, in this context, we are working with network operators, vendors, application developers, and you see some terminology, and I just want to explain a little bit what this terminology means. So I mentioned this new testbed infrastructure, 5G Berlin. So this 5G Berlin testbed is a physical instance which is located here in Berlin. And in fact, you see a slide a little bit later which shows the current blueprint of this. The idea here is that Fraunhofer Institute's HHI, with its 5G access and photonic testbeds, plus our 5G playground, you have seen this yesterday, provide an infrastructure which is available at Focus premises, at HHI premises, in the city center, and in Tempelhof, for instance. You know, we have this old airport which is currently not really used but should become an innovation park. So for instance, there are crazy ideas to do also some autonomous driving on this and things like this. So this means our approach here, together with the Senate of Berlin, is to investigate with network operators and vendors who could join this initiative in the near future to have a distributed testbed infrastructure where newest technologies can be really field trialed here in the capital of Germany. So, and this means it's an aggregation of functionalities and components, plus there is, of course, for us, a more ambitious target. We want to create what we call the 5G world. So this means it's a set of test beds which is interconnected, ideally, and exchanging experiences and maybe interesting applications with each other. So we have relationships these days established with Japan, with Korea. We are pretty soon opening some relationships to the US. We have, of course, links to other European countries and operators who are making use of our infrastructure. And of course, an idea is, if you don't have anything, start with something. This something could be our toolkits, or could be the toolkits of some vendor. And of course, the biggest problem these days is there is no 5G standard. Everyone talks about 5G. When you now do 5G prototyping, what we are talking about. So, of course, we need to go for best practices. And best practices, as I have shown to you before, it's open flow, it's network function virtualization and technologies which allow dynamic placement of components. It's the existing radio technologies plus, of course, upcoming technologies. So what we are doing these days is really to do prototyping and network slicing and VNO support, for instance. So this is the terminology, and basically this is what you can see here now as a high-level architecture of the 5G infrastructure. So this means we have here the environment at HHI, which makes use of our logical control platform, so our data center, which of course could be brought to a location in the access network environment, so we can support this mobile edge computing by shipping dynamically or deploying our technologies at the premises where it is needed. And of course, it could be brought to other places in the city, and particularly supporting different application domains. So that's the idea. So unfortunately, I don't have too much time to go into the details, and hopefully you have seen yesterday already a little bit of the type of research we are doing. But in the end, and I think this is the key message, and this is where we are focusing at Focus with my team, we believe that there is, and let's call it the reincarnation of the intelligent network. Those guys who know my past, you should know that I was quite active in intelligent networks and service creation, and in intelligent networks we had the notion of service independent building blocks, so the Lego brick system for creating services. We are now talking 25 years later in 5G controlled platforms exactly about the same thing. So we are currently in the definition of a new project with Deutsche Telekom and other big players in the 5GPP context, where we define such building blocks for 5G controlled platforms and allow a dynamic placement of these created services at different places at the network, central or edge. So, of course, we have a strong work on service orchestration. So this means different components have to be placed at the right places, and particularly this is important to optimize the network usage, also not only during the day, but during the lifetime of a service. And we, as I mentioned before, assume a highly agile network and service environment in this context. So security and identity management are key components in this context because we talk about multiple access network technologies which have to be taken into account. We talk about different application domains which have their own kinds of identity management. So this is something where we are focusing on. Of course, we particularly go for supporting factories and the dynamic programming of robots in this context, and to bring the intelligence into fog nodes, for instance. So there is a big activity in Berlin towards this industrial internet support. Of course, the challenge in the future will be particularly the support of low delay and highly distributed infrastructures. So this is something what we are doing in the research domain. So I don't go too much into these research topics. These slides will be made available for you. But for us, of course, it's also important to gain an understanding how to provide distributed test beds and how to coordinate among them. So I don't go further into this. So the idea is to have really here an infrastructure which allows for benchmarking and a little bit later for certification of 5G infrastructures. So what is the nucleus of all this? So it's called the 5G playground, an extension of the old IMS playground. We have different toolkits which could be used standalone or in combination, in this combination or in combination with products from vendors. And just briefly, the Open SDN core is an open flow implementation, and here we particularly enable the building of high efficient infrastructures for low delay and flexible access network integration. The 5G core is basically the overlay on top of this, allowing dynamic function placement for control platforms. A specific control platform for the machine type communication is 5G MTC, particularly for the dynamic deployment of services and support of identity management. And one of the most important toolkits in this context is OpenBayten. This, by the way, is the only open source toolkit we are creating. So those are closed source toolkits according to our proven business model. But this is a toolkit which is open source and implements the ATSI Mano specification. So ATSI NFV is a standardization activity or a pre-standardization activity from ATSI in the field of network function virtualization, and the management and orchestration functionality allows the deployment of components according to a specific service requirements pattern, for instance. So I don't go into the details of those slides which are describing a little bit what these toolkits can do. So we are using these toolkits at Focus. In 5G Berlin, we are interconnected to the Heinrich Hertz Institute and to Technical University of Berlin in order to provide this distributed testbed environment, which in addition to those locations pretty soon I have to look for Straße des 17. Juni, which should be somewhere here, I think. This area in the near future will be equipped with multiple access networks and massive MIMO infrastructures where we really want to provide services. And those services are either located in our data centers or dynamically could be provided to data centers close to the location and even to the antenna systems if needed. So just to give you an idea. And this is the Tempelhof field, so the former airport of Berlin, which is also supposed to be one new location in this context. What is not on this slide, but at least I can tell you, is that part of this environment soon will also be Deutsche Telekom, because Deutsche Telekom also has T-Labs here, and T-Labs is also doing 5G research, and pretty soon also Vodafone will join in this context as well. So in addition to Dresden, they are also keen to look what is happening in 5G here in the capital, because we have interesting application domains. So 5G world is deployments in Korea, in Japan, and in other locations of Europe, and again financed by projects from the European Commission and financed by direct peer contracts. We are setting up this infrastructure. You also see here the satellite backhaul. So we are also working with ESA, the European Space Agency, who is looking into this field quite interested, because there are some locations, obviously, which can be best reached by a satellite backhaul infrastructure. So I don't go further into these details. So the idea is, and this is the mini sales pitch here, if you're interested in getting started with 5G, if you're interested in working with us, there are different options to do this. Of course, the idea is you can clone the infrastructure at your premises. You can have a remote access to this infrastructure when you are acting in the control plane. So this means testbed to go, testbed as a service. And of course, what we are trying to achieve with 5G World Federation is an infrastructure which works together, allows the exchange of experiences and bundling of competencies which might be needed in a specific location for prototyping a specific use case, for instance. So these are the ideas, and in fact, it's not ideas, we are doing it already, and we are now looking for interested partners in the different regions of the world. So this means, according to our roadmap, we have our 5G World node, so to say, to be shipped. It has been shipped twice and is now deployed at other places as well. In November, when we have another milestone, the Fusiko Forum, and a bigger event which is called the 5G Berlin Week, we already will have the 5G playground, the 5G Berlin testbed in place, and first cooperations with 5G partners, the 5G World partners. In this context, for those who have, coming back to my right leg, my academic leg, I have created a work group within the IEEE SDN initiative, which is called Open Source, but not only open source, toolkits, testbeds, and federated testbeds. And those of you who are playing with SDN, you know you have to use OpenFlow to a large extent. OpenFlow comes from ONF. ONF is doing a lot of things in the US. OneLab is one of these SDN testbeds, which is now reaching to Japan, Korea, pretty soon to Europe. And together with these guys, we are talking about how to link infrastructures in order to provide services to operators, consulting and experience services. So the mission here is, together with PhD students all around the world, to create a catalog of useful toolkits, have a catalog of useful testbeds, and have some understanding which testbeds are interconnected. So for instance, OpenBaton is one of those toolkits which can be used. The 5G Playground or 5G Berlin testbed is one of those testbeds. And the Federation is, for instance, the Softfire project, which is linking 5G UK, 5G Italy, and 5G here in Berlin, which is T-Labs and Focus. Yeah? And so we want to make this information available for those who want to start to play in this context. And it's not only the academic ones, but it's also the industry. So look at the IEEE webpage and you will find more information about this initiative. So we are creating these toolkits. So when you found some interest in that, what I told you, and found interest in the super cool city of Berlin, there's a chance to come back. The first week of November, we run this 5G Berlin week, which is Prosecco Forum at the end of the week, 5G Summit in the middle of the week, and the conference on standards in communications and networks, which is on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And there will also be on the Monday an IEEE SDN meeting to bring together all those interested federated testbeds. So massive 5G testbed experiences week, I would call it. So I hope that you found some useful information in this presentation. Parts of my team are here. Marius will be here tomorrow. And yeah, that's it more or less from my side at this point in time. Thank you.
Very important. I know that it's still like a lot of debating about standardization, and you are working hard to make something like happening. When you expect that we'll see all this on the streets, all the 5G interconnected machines and humans?
Okay, so I was just talking yesterday with Werner Mohr, who is more or less one of the famous guys in 5GPP, and 5GPP is organizing now workshops with 5G Americas and with China and with Japan and so on in order to go for global standards. Yeah? And now the main question, and we had some kind of debate, what is a global 5G standard? Of course, it's for the radio interface. So the new frequencies and the portable device in 5G, this has to be standardized. And we have to avoid the 3G and 4G experiences with incompatible phones which do not operate in specific frequency bands in some other areas. So this is not happening before 2020. Yeah? Nevertheless, it is clear, or it should be clear for most of you by my talk, the whole thing starts from the core network and from the service platforms. And this virtualization of platforms is already starting. So when you today implement RTC and multimedia services and even voice over IP services, you are doing this probably in a virtualized way. And this, what you are doing today, will be just a network slice in 5G. So the challenge is now, and this is why we put a lot of emphasis in the how to manage a network slice and those management interfaces. And OpenBaton is such a reference toolkit. These reference interfaces will become key to be manageable, to be deployable in this new environment. So I would assume, and the milestones, 2018 Korea Olympics, 2020 Japan Olympics, and I would say the whole prototyping and field trials are happening in the 2017-18 time frame. So 5G will come up from the inner part, full plug and play, all around the globe, 25.
Okay, I would say it's quite optimistic. But I think it would be a reality because everything we see IoT, it's happening, and I agree with this one that practically we will not see like a switch is gonna emerge, right?
Yeah, the point is when we talk, let me be straight on this. Many people use the use case autonomous driving. Obviously, autonomous driving, you have to go into those presentations from the automotive mafia. Due to legal things and so on, will not happening finally you just enter, like in Minority Report, a car. Not before 2030, because the whole legal frameworks are not in place and all this stuff. But autonomous driving on a highway, in a specific situation is probably going to happen past 2020, but closer to 2020. So this means some of these applications we will see. E-health applications will happen, smart city applications will happen. So the question is, where does 5G start and what does it encompass? Yeah? And as I mentioned, 3G incorporation, 4G incorporation is key for this. So a 4G device can be part of a 5G ecosystem.
Yeah, actually it was my concern with the regulation more than technology, because we could see it even yesterday at Focus. It's quite developed in different aspects. So it's more like it's a reticence from regulation to put all this together. And that was the only concern, to see everything in short time. But technology, it's, yeah, as you acknowledge, is pretty much what we do today, is just a bit transforming. Okay, so I think we had a very interesting presentation. And as I said, every time when we look at Fraunhofer Focus, what they do today, it's what's going to use in a few years, and be prepared to spend time in innovation in that area, because it's the business case for tomorrow in real-time communications. And again, many thanks to Thomas and Focus Institute, because without them, all this edition actually up to this one, we haven't been able to do them without their big support. Thank you, big thanks, Thomas.
Okay. So thank you. Unfortunately, I have to go to an important meeting of a subgroup of IT Gipfel at Focus right now, so I will not be available today. So contact our friends. Alberto is here from our spin-off Core Network Dynamics, and Marius will be here.
Yeah, actually, Core Network Dynamics have a very interesting